The rain wasn't just falling that night, it was coming down heavy and angry, soaking the empty road without mercy. Ethan Cole tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his old pickup truck pushing forward through the storm. His body ached after another long day at his small auto shop just outside Dallas. Grease still clung to his hands, and a deep exhaustion sat in his bones. All he wanted was to get home, take a shower, and collapse into bed. Then, he saw it. A sleek black luxury SUV, half-tilted near the shoulder, its front wheels sunken deep into the mud. The hazard lights were blinking weakly, their faint flashes barely cutting through the sheets of rain. It didn't belong out here. This road was a forgotten one, barely lit and rarely used by anyone. Ethan slowed down, his first instinct telling him to just keep driving. Everyone knew that stopping on a road like this, especially at night, was a gamble. Too many stories ended badly that way. But as he was about to press the gas, something caught his eye. A faint light inside the SUV. It was moving. Someone was in there. His heart started pounding in his chest. Against his better judgment, he pulled over a short distance away. The moment he stepped out of his truck, the rain soaked through his jacket. He approached cautiously, lowered his window just a little, and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the relentless rain. Then, a voice. It was soft, shaky, and filled with terror. "Please, help me, I can't move." Ethan froze. That wasn't a trick. That was pure, raw fear. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from his truck and walked closer, his work boots sinking into the thick mud with every step. As he reached the vehicle, the SUV's door creaked open slowly. Inside sat a woman, maybe in her early 30s. Her dark hair was soaked, clinging to her face. Her eyes were wide, brimming with panic. She was clutching her leg, her breathing fast and shallow. Her clothes were expensive, the kind you see in magazines, and the jewelry she wore glittered even in the dim light. But none of that mattered. Her expression told a completely different story, one of desperation. "I tried to get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "But, my leg, it won't work." Ethan swallowed hard, his own apprehension melting away. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady. "I've got you." He carefully lifted her from the driver's seat. She cried out softly in pain, then immediately began apologizing over and over. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have been driving." He carried her through the downpour to his truck and gently eased her into the passenger seat. Rainwater soaked the old fabric, but he couldn't care less. He slammed the door shut, climbed back into the driver's side, and cranked the heater up to full blast. She hugged herself, shivering uncontrollably. "My name is Madison," she said quietly. Ethan just nodded, putting the truck in drive and heading toward the nearest hospital. Every bump in the road made her wince in pain. About halfway there, she turned to him, her wide eyes searching his face. "You don't even know me," she said. "Why did you stop?" He glanced over at her, then back at the slick road. He answered simply, "Because you needed help." Madison just stared at him, a strange expression on her face, as if no one had ever said something so straightforward to her before. At the hospital, the emergency room was a blur of activity. Nurses rushed her inside on a gurney. As they were wheeling her away, she reached out and grabbed his sleeve. "Please," she begged, "don't leave yet." He just nodded and found a seat in the waiting area. Hours passed. He sat there, soaked, hungry, and bone-tired, but he stayed. He had given his word. Finally, a doctor came out, his face serious. But his first question was a surprise. He looked right at Ethan and asked, "Are you family?" "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "I just found her on the road." The doctor nodded slowly, studying him for a moment. "Well," he said, "you saved her from something much worse." Ethan didn't understand what he meant. Not yet, but stopping on that stormy road had changed everything. This woman, Madison, wasn't just some unlucky driver who'd gotten stuck in the mud. She was important, and her life was surrounded by dangerous things. Ethan Cole, the small-town mechanic, had just stepped right into the middle of it all. When Madison finally wakes up in her hospital bed, the truth about who she really is begins to surface. Piece by unsettling piece. Why do the hospital staff suddenly start acting differently around her room? Why do they whisper when they think no one is listening? And more importantly, why is a mysterious, well-dressed man now warning Ethan to be careful, telling him he has no idea what he's gotten himself into? The simple act of kindness on a rainy night is about to unravel a world of secrets, and Ethan is now at the very center of the storm. The hospital hallway felt frozen in time. Bright lights buzzed overhead, and the sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air. Ethan didn't realize how much time had passed since he'd arrived. He sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor, replaying the night over and over. The slick, rain-soaked road, a voice crying out in the dark, the sheer terror in her eyes. He told himself again that he could still leave. No one would blame him. He'd done more than enough, but his feet stayed planted, refusing to move. Finally, footsteps broke the silence, approaching slowly. A nurse stopped in front of him, holding a clipboard. Her expression was professional but softened when she spoke. "She's awake. You can see her now." Ethan stood up quickly, a wave of stiffness rushing through his legs. He followed her down the hall and into a quiet, dimly lit room. Madison lay on the bed, her leg wrapped in a brace and elevated on a stack of pillows. Her face was pale, but the panic from earlier was gone, replaced by a weary calm. Her eyes opened wider when she saw him. "You stayed," she said, her voice a soft whisper. Ethan simply nodded. "I said I would." Something unreadable flickered across her face. Relief, maybe, or just plain disbelief. The nurse adjusted a monitor, her movements efficient and quiet, before leaving them alone. A long moment passed as Madison studied him, his rain-soaked jacket, his heavy work boots, the grease still stubbornly clinging under his fingernails. "You waited all this time," she said, less a question and more a statement of fact. Ethan just shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more, but she stopped herself. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the window, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to break. "The doctor says my knee was dislocated," she said, breaking the silence. "They say I'm lucky." "Lucky," Ethan repeated, the words sounding hollow in the quiet room. She nodded slowly. "If you hadn't stopped, I don't know what would have happened." A heavy silence settled between them. Not awkward, just weighted with the events of the night. Just then, the door opened again. A different doctor entered, flanked by 2 nurses, and the entire mood in the room shifted. It became more formal, more tense. The doctor glanced at Ethan, a brief, dismissive look, before turning his full attention back to Madison. "Ms. Hale," he began, "we need to update your records." Ethan noticed the subtle change the way the doctor straightened his posture, the shift in his tone from clinical to deferential. "Ms. Hale." Madison closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them and looked directly at Ethan. "I guess you should know," she said. "No, what?" Ethan asked, confused. She took a steadying breath. "My full name is Madison Hale. I run a tech company based in Austin. It's been in the news a lot lately." Ethan just blinked. The words didn't quite land at first. "Okay," he said slowly, trying to process. The doctor paused, looking at him with surprise. "You're not aware of Ms. Hale's company?" Ethan shook his head. "I fix cars." Madison almost smiled at that, a genuine, fleeting expression. She continued, her voice steady. "I'm not supposed to be driving alone right now. There have been ... threats. Security protocols. Rules I decided to ignore." A chill ran down Ethan's spine at the word threats. The doctor cleared his throat. "We are recommending additional protection during your recovery, Miss Hale." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He suddenly felt like an intruder, like he'd stumbled into a world where he did not belong. Madison saw the change in him. She reached out, her fingers gently touching his arm. "I'm still the same person you helped on the road," she said softly. Ethan met her eyes. "I know," but a quiet, unsettling feeling had taken root inside him. After the doctor and his team left, Madison let out a long, slow exhale. "I hate that look," she said. "The one people get when they find out." "What look?" Ethan asked. "Like I'm no longer human. Like I'm just a headline, a stock price, an asset to be managed." She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Ethan leaned back in the hard plastic chair. "For what it's worth," he said, "you were just someone who needed help." Her throat seemed to tighten. "No one treats me like that anymore," she whispered. They talked quietly for a while longer. Madison told him how she'd been rushing to a late meeting, how exhaustion and pressure had blurred her focus. "Everyone wants something," she said, her voice laced with fatigue. "Access, money, power, a piece of you." Ethan just listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice. He just sat there and let her talk. When she finally finished, she looked at him, her gaze intense. "What do you want?" The question surprised him. "Nothing," he answered honestly. She searched his face, her eyes scanning for the angle, the catch, but there was none. Later that night, as Ethan was grabbing a coffee from the machine down the hall, a hospital staff member pulled him aside. "You should be careful," the woman whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "People like her, they bring complications." Ethan frowned. "She's just a person who got hurt." The staff member shook her head. "You don't understand." "Maybe I don't," Ethan said, "but I know what I saw on that road." When he returned to the room, Madison was watching the door, a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, "just tired." She hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. "You don't have to come back tomorrow. I know this isn't your world." Ethan thought about his garage, his sister, his simple, predictable routine. Then he remembered her voice in the rain, filled with pain and fear. "I'll stop by before work," he said. Her eyes widened slightly, filled with surprise. "You would?" He just nodded. The next morning, he returned with 2 cups of decent coffee and a warm breakfast sandwich. The smile Madison gave him was one he imagined she hadn't used in years, genuine, unguarded, and free of any agenda. For the first time, someone had shown up without wanting something. But outside her room, unseen eyes were watching. Security details, corporate assistants, People who measured every interaction, every variable, and they were all wondering the same thing. Who was this mechanic, Ethan Cole? The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Ethan returned to the hospital. The storm from the night before had completely passed, leaving the air cool, quiet, and fresh. He held a small, unassuming paper bag in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. Nothing fancy, just something warm to start the day. When he stepped into Madison's room, she looked up immediately, her face lighting up in a way that surprised even her. "You came back," she said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and wonder. "Told you I would," Ethan replied with a gentle smile. He carefully set the coffee down on her bedside table and pulled the chair closer. She reached for the cup like it was a precious treasure. "No one has ever brought me coffee in a hospital before," she admitted. "Not like this." Ethan's smile widened. "Guess there's a first time for everything." For a while, they just talked about simple things, their favorite foods, movies they'd seen, and how terribly uncomfortable hospital beds were. For the first time since the accident, Madison didn't feel like a CEO, she just felt like a person. Then, the door opened without a knock. Two men stepped inside, both tall, serious, and dressed far too sharply for a hospital. Madison's expression changed instantly, her guard shooting back up. Ethan felt the shift in the room immediately. "Good morning, Ms. Hale," one of them said, his tone formal and clipped. "We need a moment." Madison nodded reluctantly, the ease draining from her face. She turned to Ethan. "Can you give us a second?" Ethan stood up. "Sure." As he stepped into the hallway, the door closed firmly behind him. He didn't mean to listen, but in the quiet of the hospital corridor, their voices carried. "You should not be alone with strangers," one of the men said, his voice low but firm. "This is risky." A strange, protective twist tightened in Ethan's chest. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Madison had rolled her wheelchair closer to the doorway. "Ignore them," she said quietly, her frustration evident. "Friends of yours?" Ethan asked. "Security," she replied, "or what passes for it." He hesitated for a beat. "Am I a problem?" Madison met his eyes, her gaze direct and unwavering. "No," she said, "you're the only thing that feels normal right now." Before he could answer, one of the men stepped back out into the hall. "Sir," he said, looking directly at Ethan, "can I speak with you?" Ethan nodded slowly and followed him a short distance away. "I'm going to be direct," the man began, wasting no time. "You should distance yourself from Ms. Hale." Ethan frowned. "Why?" The man's expression was unreadable. "Her life comes with risks. Attention, people who don't play fair." Ethan crossed his arms, feeling a surge of irritation. "She's hurt. She needed help." The man studied him for a long moment. "You seem decent, which is exactly why you should walk away now." "Is she in danger?" Ethan pressed. The man didn't answer directly. "Just be careful," he said, before turning and walking away. Ethan returned to the room, unsettled. Madison could tell immediately. "They talked to you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. What did they say?" "That I should stay away." Her jaw tightened. "And will you?" Ethan thought about the rain, the fear in her eyes, the way she had grabbed his sleeve for support. "No," he said, the answer clear in his own mind. Madison looked down at her hands, a rare vulnerability showing. "I didn't ask for this life," she said quietly. "I built something, and it turned into a cage." Ethan pulled his chair closer again. "Then maybe you need someone who isn't part of it." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, a silent understanding passing between them. Later that day, Madison was cleared to leave the hospital in 2 days. But there was a problem. She couldn't walk on her own yet, and she had no one nearby to help. Ethan assumed she had staff, assistants, or family. She just shook her head. Everyone is busy. Or far away. That night, as Ethan was preparing to leave, Madison spoke hesitantly. Could you help me get home when I'm discharged?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Her home, her world, was not his. Her problems were clearly much bigger than oil changes and paying rent. But then, a memory surfaced: his mother, and how strangers had once helped her when no one else would. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm. "I can do that." The relief on her face was instant and profound. The next day, Ethan arrived to find security everywhere. Whispers followed him down the hall. Phones were held up discreetly. Eyes watched his every move. One of the nurses, who had been kind to him, pulled him aside. "Be careful," she whispered. "People like her changed lives." Ethan replied quietly. She already did. When Madison was finally discharged, Ethan helped her carefully into his old, reliable truck. A sleek, black security car followed them closely. The drive was silent at first, filled with unspoken thoughts. Then Madison broke the silence. "I haven't trusted anyone like this in a long time." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Trust goes both ways," he said. When they reached her home, Ethan nearly stopped breathing. The house wasn't a house. It was a modern architectural statement. Massive glass walls, clean lines, everything perfect and cold. It looked more like a museum than a home. He hesitated at the door, instinctively wiping his dusty boots on the mat. Madison noticed. "Don't worry," she said softly. "You belong here." Inside, the silence was heavy, echoing off the polished surfaces. "This is where I work, sleep, and think," she said, her voice small in the vast space, but it never really felt like home. Ethan helped her settle onto a large, minimalist sofa. As he turned to leave, Madison's voice stopped him. "Stay," she said, her tone pleading. "Just for a bit, please." And without fully realizing it, Ethan stepped completely into a world that was not his own. A world filled with power, pressure, and unseen danger. The closer he got, the harder it would be to walk away. Living under the same roof changes everything. Boundaries begin to blur, and feelings grow in the shared, quiet moments. But one unexpected incident inside the house soon proves that Madison-esque world is far more dangerous than Ethan could ever have imagined. The house was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was just empty. I felt it the second the heavy front door clicked shut behind us. No hum of a refrigerator, no distant TV, no clutter, no signs of life at all, except for Madison and me. She settled onto a wide white couch as carefully as she could, her movements slow and practiced. I saw a flash of pain cross her face before she could hide it. "You okay?" I asked. She just nodded. Pain comes and goes. I walked through the vast living space, not sure where to even stand. The place felt more like a museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls reflected the afternoon light, making everything feel exposed. Every surface was perfect, polished, and untouched. I cleared my throat, the sound feeling too loud in the silence. "You hungry?" Madison smiled, a faint, tired thing. I forgot what that feels like. I found my way to the kitchen. It was all gleaming stainless steel and modern gadgets that looked like they'd never been used. I opened the fridge and just paused. There was food, sure, but none of it felt real. Pre-packaged gourmet meals, strange green drinks, things with labels I couldn't even pronounce. "You actually cook here?" I called out. "Not really," she replied, her voice echoing slightly. I sighed and rolled up my sleeves. I wasn't a chef, but I could make something real. I hunted through the pristine cabinets and eventually found eggs, bread, and butter. Simple things, real things. When I brought her a plate with scrambled eggs and toast, she looked at it like it was a priceless gift. "You made this?" "Yeah," I said, feeling a little awkward. She laughed, a soft, breathy sound. "I can't remember the last time someone cooked for me." As she ate, we talked. I told her about my auto shop, my little sister, the small town I grew up in. She listened closely, her eyes fixed on me, like the little details of my ordinary life actually mattered. Later that evening, Madison dozed off on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket. I sat nearby, flipping through a design magazine I had zero interest in, just wanting to be there in case she woke up. That's when I heard it. A sound, soft, sharp, and completely out of place in the sterile silence of the house. I froze, every muscle tensing. The sound came again, clearer this time. From the other side of the house, I stood up slowly, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. Madison stirred in her sleep. "What is it?" she murmured. "Stay here," I said quietly, my voice low. I moved toward the hallway, each step deliberate and careful. The house felt different now, not empty anymore. It felt watched. The sound came again, metal against glass. I clenched my fists, my palms sweating. I turned the corner and stopped dead. One of the huge floor-to-ceiling windows was slightly ajar. Cool, rain-scented air drifted inside, but that wasn't what made my chest tighten. A shadow moved outside, a flicker of motion in the darkness. I stepped back slowly, trying not to make a sound. "Ethan," Madison called out, her voice filled with a sleepy concern that quickly turned to alarm. I hurried back to her. "Someone's outside," I whispered. The color drained from her face. "Security?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No idea." She reached for her phone with shaking hands, but before she could dial, the sound came again, closer this time, much closer. I grabbed a heavy, abstract metal sculpture from a side table. It wasn't a weapon, but it would have to do. I positioned myself between Madison and the dark hallway. "If someone comes in, stay behind me." Madison just stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. "You should leave. Get out of here." "Not happening," I said, my gaze locked on the hallway. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, we heard voices. Low, muffled, just outside the glass. A bright flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the living room. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. This wasn't some random misunderstanding. Suddenly, a loud, firm knock echoed through the house. 3 sharp raps on the front door. Madison exhaled sharply, a wave of relief washing over her. "Security," she called out, her voice shaky. "Come in." 2 uniformed guards entered, their eyes quickly scanning the room. One of them turned to Madison. "Ma'am, we detected movement near the perimeter." Everything is secure now. You're safe. I slowly lowered the heavy object in my hand, my arm aching. After they left, Madison buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. This, she said, her voice muffled. This is what I meant. This is my life. I sat beside her on the couch. That wasn't normal. Madison, she let out a bitter laugh. It is for me. Silence hung between us for a long time. Later that night, as the city lights twinkled outside the glass walls, Madison spoke softly. You saw it now. The tension. The fear. She wouldn't look at me. I would understand if you leave tomorrow. I thought about it for a long moment. About the quiet desperation in her eyes, the invisible cage she lived in. I'm not scared of people with flashlights, I said finally. She looked up at me, surprised. I'm scared of people being alone when they shouldn't be. Her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. The next day, the incident was all anyone talked about. Her phone rang constantly. Security was doubled. One of her assistants, a woman with a permanently stressed expression, pulled me aside. You shouldn't get attached, she warned, her voice low. This world, it eats people like you. I just looked at her calmly. Then maybe it needs people like me. Madison overheard. I saw it in her eyes. That night, we sat quietly again, watching the sky darken. I never asked if this was fair to you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I just shrugged. Life isn't fair. But walking away when someone needs you, that's a choice. She looked at me then. I mean, she really looked at me, and for the first time in what she said felt like years, Madison felt safe. Not because of the concrete walls, or the guards, or the money, but because someone chose to stay. But we were naive to think it was over. Outside the house, unseen eyes were still watching, and we were about to find out that the next threat wouldn't come with a polite, warning knock. It would be delivered silently. A message on a screen that would shake Madison's world to its core, and put me, the simple mechanic from a small town, directly in the crosshairs. The danger wasn't gone, it was just getting started. The message arrived just after midnight. Madison was half asleep on the couch, her injured leg propped up on a stack of pillows. In the soft light of the living room, Ethan sat at the dining table, quietly fixing a loose hinge on a kitchen cabinet. The house was calm, but it was the kind of stillness that feels like it's holding its breath. Madison's phone buzzed on the coffee table. Once, then again. She tried to ignore it, letting her eyes drift closed. But a knot of unease tightened in her chest. With a sigh, she reached for it. The moment her eyes hit the screen, her expression shifted. The color drained from her face. Ethan, sensing the change in the room's atmosphere, looked up. What is it? He asked, his voice low. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Someone knows you're here. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ethan stood up, leaving the screwdriver on the table. Who? Her hand trembled as she held out the phone. Someone who shouldn't. He took it. The message was short, anonymous, and terrifyingly direct. We see you, we see him. Don't make mistakes. A hot surge of anger rose in Ethan's chest. Who sent this? He demanded, his voice tight. Madison shook her head, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. No name, no number, just presser. He handed the phone back, his mind racing. Is this common for you? He asked, his voice softer now. She looked away. More than I want to admit. Ethan began to pace the length of the room, the quiet tranquility of the house now shattered. Why involve me? What do they get out of this? Madison's voice cracked when she answered, heavy with unspoken guilt. Because you mattered to me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Just minutes later, the house was no longer quiet. Security arrived, their presence both reassuring and a stark reminder of the danger. Phones rang and hushed. Urgent voices overlapped, creating a tense symphony of crisis. One of the guards, a tall man with a grim face, turned to Ethan. You should leave. Tonight. Ethan stared back at him, unflinching. No. Before the guard could argue, Madison's voice cut through the room, sharp and absolute. He stays. The room fell silent. The security team exchanged uneasy looks. Ms. Hale, this isn't safe, the guard insisted, his tone professional but firm. Anyone close to you becomes leverage. Ethan looked at Madison, searching her face for the truth. Is that true? She gave a slow, painful nod. They use what I care about against me. Ethan let out a long, slow breath, his resolve hardening. Then they picked the wrong person. Later that night, long after security had swept the house and established a perimeter, the two of them sat in the living room, the silence stretching between them. Madison finally broke it. I never meant to pull you into this, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned forward, his gaze direct. You didn't. I walked in. She studied his face, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. Why? She asked. Why stay? Ethan thought of his own past, of his mother, of long nights spent waiting for help that never came. Because, he said, his voice steady, when you leave people alone in their worst moment, that stays with them. I'm not leaving. The next morning, Ethan returned to his auto shop for the first time since his accident. The world felt different, sharper. The familiar roar of engines and the easy chatter of customers now felt like a thin veil over a much darker reality. His mind wasn't on spark plugs or oil changes. It was back at the house. With Madison, round noon, his unease was justified. A sleek black sedan pulled up outside. Two men in expensive suits got out and walked into the shop. They didn't smile. Ethan Cole, one of them asked, his voice devoid of warmth. Yeah, Ethan replied, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. We represent interested parties. The man continued. They would like you to distance yourself from Ms. Hale. Ethan's grip tightened on the rag. No. The other man spoke up. There would be compensation. A significant amount. Ethan tossed the rag onto a workbench. I'm not for sale. The two men exchanged a look, their professional masks slipping for just a second. Think carefully, Mr. Cole, the first one warned, a subtle threat coloring his words. Accidents happen. Ethan took a step closer, meeting their cold stares with one of his own. So do witnesses. He let the word hang in the air. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, without another word, the men turned and left. That evening, when Ethan returned to Madison's house, she saw the look on his face immediately. Someone came to my shop, he said, his voice flat. The color drained from her face. They had crossed a line, bringing the threat into his world, his life. They crossed a line, she said, her voice trembling with rage. Ethan nodded grimly. So did I. She wheeled her chair closer, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests of the couch. This is why I push people away. She choked out to protect them. Ethan knelt beside her chair, his presence a solid anchor in her storm. And this, he said gently, is why you shouldn't have to. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears she refused to let fall. The next few days were thick with tension. Security was doubled. The threatening messages stopped, which was somehow more unnerving than their arrival. The silence was a countdown. One evening, Madison broke it. If things get worse, if it gets really bad, she started, her gaze fixed on the floor. Promise me you'll walk away. Just go. Ethan shook his head without hesitation. I'll promise to be smart. I won't promise to be gone. A weak, humorless laugh escaped her lips. You're impossible. He offered a small smile. Maybe, later that night, as Ethan was settling onto the guest couch, Madison's voice came from her room, soft but clear. You know they won't stop, right? He didn't need to see her to know the fear she was battling. I know, he replied. Then why stay? The question was simple, but the answer was everything. Because fear shouldn't get to decide who we help, or who we stand by. There was a long pause. Then, she reached out from her doorway and took his hand. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was something deeper, something quieter. It was trust, forged in fire. But outside the safety of those walls, the enemy was regrouping. The warning had failed. The intimidation hadn't worked. Their next move would have to be louder, closer, and impossible to ignore. The threat was about to become terrifyingly physical. A violent confrontation was brewing, one that would force Ethan to choose between his own safety and his promise to stay. The choice would define them both, and the price of that choice was something neither of them could yet imagine. The tension in the house was a living thing. It didn't just linger, it thickened, growing heavier with each passing hour. Every little sound seemed amplified, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator. Every light outside the windows felt closer, more intrusive, like prying eyes in the dark. Madison saw it in the way her security team moved. They were sharper now, their movements more precise, quieter. Their eyes were always scanning, always watching. They were a silent, coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. She asked Ethan if he would help her practice moving without her wheelchair. Her doctor had been insistent, encouraging her to take small, tentative steps to reclaim her mobility piece by piece. Ethan immediately agreed, his expression serious and focused. He stood close, a sentinel at her side, one hand hovering near her back, ready to catch her if she faltered. His eyes were locked on her, not on her face, but on her balance, her posture, tracking every minute shift in her weight. I hate this, she muttered, her voice tight with frustration. I hate feeling so weak. Ethan's gaze softened for a moment. You're not weak, he said, his voice low and steady. You're healing. There's a world of difference. Encouraged by his words, she took a breath and pushed herself up. She took one step, then another. A sharp flash of pain crossed her face, a wince she couldn't hide, but she bit her lip and kept going. It wasn't the shrill, panicked scream of a fire alarm, but something more sinister, a targeted warning. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. He moved to her side, positioning himself between her and the direction of the commotion. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice a firm anchor in the rising chaos. Suddenly, the power flickered. The lights buzzed and died, plunging the room into a disorienting twilight. A moment later, a new sound ripped through the air, the unmistakable, violent shattering of glass. It was close. Too close. "Move, now," one of the guards shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. They swarmed around Madison, creating a human shield as they rushed her toward the reinforced safe room. Ethan stuck right with them, his eyes darting around, trying to see the threat in the dim, flashing emergency lights. A loud crash echoed from the hallway behind them, followed by a man's shout to stop. The sounds of a struggle erupted, grunts, the thud of bodies hitting walls. Then, an abrupt, chilling silence. Inside the safe room, the heavy steel door boomed shut, sealing them in. The sudden quiet was almost as jarring as the noise had been. Madison was trembling, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Ethan gently took her arm, holding her steady, lending her his strength. "Breathe," he said softly, "just breathe." The minutes crawled by, each one stretching into an eternity. The only sound was the hum of the air filtration system and their own ragged breathing. Finally, a voice crackled through the intercom on the door. "All clear? Threat neutralized." Madison sagged against Ethan, the fight going out of her in a wave of relief. The aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. Questions flooded the air. Phones rang incessantly. Police and senior security officials arrived, their faces grim as they surveyed the damage and reviewed the incident. Hours later, long after the authorities had left, Ethan sat alone in the vast, silent kitchen. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a tremor in his hands he couldn't seem to stop. He stared at his shaking fingers, feeling a strange disconnect from his own body. A senior guard, a man named Marcus, with tired eyes and a stoic demeanor, approached him quietly. He'd seen everything. "You put yourself at risk today, son," Marcus said, his voice low. Ethan finally looked up from his hands. "She needed my help." Marcus studied him for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. "You know this isn't going to stop, right? They'll escalate. They always do." Ethan's jaw tightened. He met the older man's gaze, a new, hard resolve settling in his own eyes. He nodded slowly. "Then so will I that night." Sleep was impossible for Madison. The events of the day played on a loop in her mind. Unable to stay in bed, she wheeled herself silently through the darkened house, the soft whir of the chair the only sound. She found Ethan sitting in the living room, staring out at the inky blackness of the grounds, a solitary figure silhouetted against the window. She stopped a few feet away from him. "I saw you," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. "When the glass broke, you stepped in front of me. You didn't even hesitate." Ethan turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "I would do it again," he said simply. There was no bravado in his tone, just a statement of fact. She swallowed, a knot forming in her throat. "I don't want to be the reason something happens to you." "You're not a reason," Ethan replied calmly, his voice cutting through her fear. "You're a person who's being threatened. It's not your fault." A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken thoughts and the weight of the day. Finally, Madison broke it. "There's something I haven't told you," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan just listened, giving her the space to speak. "These threats, they're not random," she continued, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "They're tied to a business deal. A company wanted to acquire my research, my patents, everything. They wanted control. I refused. They didn't take no for an answer." Her voice trembled. "I should have just walked away, sold it to them." "No," Ethan said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You shouldn't be punished for saying no. You built something, and you have the right to protect it." She stared at him, really seeing the conviction in his eyes. He wasn't just a bodyguard, he was an ally, a protector in a way that went beyond a job description. "Tomorrow," she said, a new strength in her voice, a decision solidifying in her mind. "I'm making a move, a decision that will change everything." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. "Whatever it is," he said, his voice a steady promise in the dark, "you don't face it alone." Outside, the ever-watchful security cameras scanned the night. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their senses on high alert, but they were all guarding against the wrong thing. The real battle was no longer just about keeping intruders out. It was about what was about to happen inside. It was about the choice Madison was about to make. A choice that could expose everything, the power plays, the corporate threats, the ugly truth. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Ethan had to decide where he truly stood. Would he remain in the shadows, a protector hidden from view, or would he step into the spotlight with her, facing the consequences, and risk walking away from this life forever. Because they both knew, once Madison took that next step, there would be no turning back. Morning light spilled across the living room, soft and quiet. The house felt different after the night before, less like a fortress and more like a place where truth could finally breathe. Madison sat near the window, her injured leg propped up, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept. Ethan stood by the kitchen counter, the familiar sounds of him making coffee filling the space between them. Neither of them spoke at first, letting the new day settle in. Finally, it was Madison who broke the silence. Her voice was clear, cutting through the quiet hum of the house. "I'm done hiding." Ethan turned from the coffee maker to face her, his expression questioning. "What does that mean?" She took a breath, slow and steady, gathering her strength. "I'm going public. And I don't mean carefully worded press releases or interviews pre-screened by lawyers. I mean the full story. My story." Ethan's brow furrowed with concern. "That's going to make a lot of noise." "Madison, it already has," she replied, her voice firm. "The noise has been there all along. I just kept pretending I could control it. Keep it quiet, but you can't control a storm by whispering at it." He nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. "And the deal?" he asked. "I'll expose it," she said, the decision solidifying with each word. The pressure, the threats, all of it, the whole ugly truth. Ethan considered the immense weight of her words, the danger she was walking into. That puts you right in front of them, a direct target. Madison met his eyes, her gaze unwavering. It also takes away their power. Their greatest weapon is secrecy and fear. "I'm taking that away from them." As if on cue, the house sprang to life. The security team reacted immediately. Phones began to ring incessantly, voices rising in urgent, argumentative tones down the hall. One of Madison's top advisors insisted it was far too dangerous, a reckless move that would put her in harm's way. Another warned of the catastrophic impact on the market, of stock prices plummeting. Madison listened to it all with a calm that was almost unnerving. She let them speak, let them voice their fears and their strategies. And when they were done, she said just one thing, her voice leaving no room for debate. "I'm not asking for your permission." Ethan watched her, and in that moment, he saw her transform. She wasn't just a CEO anymore, a powerful figurehead of a major corporation. She was someone shedding a skin, becoming something raw, something fiercely honest. Later that afternoon, after the storm of calls had subsided, she asked Ethan to sit beside her on the couch. There was a different kind of quiet between them now, one of anticipation. "There's something else," she began. He waited, letting her find the words. "If I do this, when I do this, your name is going to come up. People will ask questions. They'll want to know why a mechanic was with me, why I trusted you over my own team." Ethan offered a faint, reassuring smile. "I can handle a few questions." She hesitated, her gaze searching his. "Ethan, it could change your life. Your entire life." He just shrugged, a simple gesture that carried so much weight. "It already has." A soft laugh escaped her, the first genuine, light sound he had heard from her in days. It was like a small crack of light in a dark room. The statement went out the next morning. It was raw, direct, and profoundly human. In a video recorded on her own phone, Madison spoke. She talked about the accident, not as a news headline, but as a terrifying, life-altering event. She spoke about the threats that followed, the suffocating pressure she endured behind closed doors. She spoke about fear, not as a weakness, but as a natural human response. And then, she spoke about kindness. She mentioned a man who stopped in the pouring rain, a stranger who asked for nothing in return, who simply stayed and helped. Ethan listened from the kitchen, his heart feeling both heavy and full. He heard her describe him not by name, but by his actions. The protector, the confidant. The public response was immediate and explosive. A tidal wave of support, shock, and outrage swept across social media and news outlets. But with the support came intense scrutiny. By evening, a swarm of reporters and news vans waited outside the gates, their cameras like hungry eyes. The security detail tightened, the perimeter around the house becoming even more impenetrable. Madison looked exhausted, but also lighter, as if she'd finally set down a burden she'd been carrying for a lifetime. "I feel free," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. That night, Ethan's phone buzzed with a call from his sister. "Why are you on the news?" she asked, her voice a mix of laughter and genuine worry. He smiled into the phone. "It's a long story." The next day, Ethan returned to his auto shop. But it didn't feel the same. The familiar smell of grease and metal was now mixed with something else. Curiosity. People stared. They whispered as he walked by, but it wasn't all bad. One of his longtime customers walked right up to him, grabbed his hand, and shook it firmly. "You did the right thing," the man said, his eyes filled with respect. A few minutes later, another warned him, "Be careful, son, these are powerful people." Ethan just nodded and worked through it all. The rhythm of his tools, a comforting constant in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. That evening, he found Madison quietly watching the news coverage in the living room. The anchors were praising her bravery, her integrity. "They're calling you a hero," she said, turning to him. Ethan shook his head. "I just stopped." She looked at him, her expression serious, her eyes holding his. "Not everyone does." Later, she found him on the back porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. She rolled her wheelchair out to join him, the quiet hum of its motor the only sound. "I don't know what happens next," she said, her voice small against the vastness of the night. Ethan kept his gaze on the sky. "Neither do I." She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "But I know I don't want to go through it alone." Ethan finally turned to meet her gaze, the unspoken feelings between them now impossible to ignore. "Then you won't," he said, his voice a quiet promise. Inside the house, the world was shifting. Plans were changing. The threats that had once seemed insurmountable were beginning to weaken as the truth spread like wildfire. But even as the danger receded, one last consequence remained. A choice that would define not just their futures, but what they were to each other. Because once all the noise faded, once the crisis ended, and the world moved on to the next story, what remained between them would be real. The question was no longer about survival. It was about what happens after. What happens when the hero and the person he saved have to figure out how to just be a man and a woman, building a life in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The house felt quieter than it had in weeks. Not tense, not watched, just still. Madison noticed it first. No alarms blaring, no voices rushing down the halls, no phones vibrating off the hook every few minutes. She sat near the window, watching the sunlight move slowly across the hardwood floor. For the first time since the accident, her breathing felt completely normal, deep and even. Ethan was nearby, cleaning up dishes from lunch. The simple clink of plates, the soft sound of running water, it was a comfortable silence. "It's strange," Madison said, her voice soft in the quiet room. "I spent so long preparing for chaos, bracing for the next bad thing. I never really thought about what came after." Ethan dried his hands on a towel and nodded, leaning against the counter. "After is usually the hardest part." She turned from the window to look at him. "Everyone leaves after the storm passes." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact she'd learned over and over again. He met her eyes, his gaze steady. "Not everyone." Later that day, the security team scaled back. One guard left, then another. By sunset, it was just the normal house staff. The sprawling mansion suddenly felt bigger, emptier, less crowded. Madison practiced walking with her crutches, taking tentative steps across the living room. Each one felt a little steadier than the last. Ethan stayed close, but he didn't hover over her. He had learned the delicate balance of when to offer support and when to trust her own strength. That evening, they sat at the massive kitchen counter, sharing a simple meal of soup and bread. It felt almost domestic. "I used to think success meant never slowing down," Madison confessed, swirling her spoon in the bowl. "Always pushing, always climbing. Now I'm scared of speeding up again." Ethan considered her words for a moment. "Maybe you don't have to go back to that speed. Maybe you get to choose a different pace, now." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Maybe." The next morning, Ethan prepared to return to his shop full-time. He had put his own life on hold for weeks. Standing at the front door, dressed in his work clothes, he hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. Madison noticed it from the sofa. "You can go," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You don't owe me anything." "You've done more than enough." Ethan let out a long breath. "I know," and then he left. The heavy door clicked shut, and the house, which had just started to feel like a home, felt cavernous and empty the moment he was gone. Madison spent the day trying to be productive. She answered emails, took calls, started making plans. But something felt off. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was just quiet. By evening, she found herself listening for the sound of a car in the driveway, waiting for a key in the lock. When Ethan finally returned, looking tired but carrying a bag of takeout, the sense of relief that washed over her was so intense, it caught her by surprise. "You came back," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He set the food on the counter and offered a light, teasing smile. "I live here now, remember?" She laughed, a real unburdened sound, then stopped. "Do you?" The question hung in the air between them, suddenly serious. Ethan's playful expression faded. He leaned against the counter, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know where I fit in all this yet, Madison." She wheeled her office chair closer to him, her crutches leaning against the island. "I never asked what you want. Through all of this, what do you want?" He hesitated, the answer clearly, something he'd thought about a lot. "I want peace," he said quietly. "I want honesty. I want to wake up in the morning without feeling like I've failed someone." She listened, her heart aching with a familiar feeling. "I want that too," she whispered. A new kind of silence stretched between them, not empty, but comfortable and full of unsaid things. Later that night, Madison stood at the edge of the wide porch, leaning on her crutches. Ethan stood beside her, not touching, just present. In the distance, the city lights of the skyline glowed, a glittering testament to the world she used to rule. "I used to look at that skyline and feel so powerful," she said, her voice barely a murmur against the night air. Now I just feel tired. Ethan's gaze followed hers. Power is loud, he replied. Peace is quiet. She glanced at him, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. You always say things like that. He shrugged, a simple, self-effacing gesture. Comes from living a small life. Her smile widened. I'm learning how much that matters. The days passed, and life settled into a new, gentle rhythm. Madison continued her physical therapy, growing stronger. Ethan balanced his time between his workshop and the house. The world outside, the world of frantic deals and front-page stories, slowly moved on, forgetting them. One afternoon, Madison sat on the patio, watching Ethan fix a loose railing on the porch steps. He was focused, his movements efficient and sure. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, she realized something profound. No one in her life had ever stayed when things became ordinary. They were there for the thrill, the crisis, the victory, but never for the quiet in between. That night, as they cleaned up after dinner, she spoke the question that had been forming in her mind. What happens when I'm fully healed? She asked quietly. When I don't need anyone to look after me. Ethan didn't answer right away. He carefully placed a dish in the rack, his back to her. Finally, he turned around. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know I'm not here because you were hurt. She looked at him, confused. Then why are you here? His eyes were serious, unwavering. Because you matter, not your money, not your name. You. Her throat tightened, and she felt a sudden, sharp sting behind her eyes. I'm afraid, she admitted, the confession so soft it was almost lost in the room. I'm afraid that when this all ends, you'll leave. Ethan stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. His own voice was laced with a vulnerability she'd never heard before. I'm afraid of that too. And there it was. The truth neither of them had dared to say out loud. She laughed softly, a shaky sound that was half a sob, tears welling in her eyes. They stood there, not touching, not rushing to fill the silence. Just being honest. Outside the gates of the estate, the world kept spinning. Business deals resumed. Sensational stories faded into old news. But inside the house, in the quiet spaces between two people, something real had formed, something fragile and precious. And now, it faced its final, most difficult test. Because love doesn't grow in the middle of danger and chaos. It grows in the calm. And the calm reveals everything. This wasn't about surviving a threat anymore. It was about a choice. Two people, standing on the precipice of a normal life, having to decide if they were brave enough to choose each other. Morning arrived gently. No sirens, no alerts, no guards rushing through halls. Just sunlight and quiet. Madison stood by the window without her crutches for the very first time. Her leg was still stiff, still healing, but it was strong enough. Ethan watched from the kitchen, pretending not to stare. You're standing, she said softly. He smiled. Looks like it. She took a few careful, wobbly steps, then stopped and laughed. A real laugh, free and light. I forgot what this felt like, she said, her voice filled with a sense of rediscovery. Ethan walked closer, his presence a quiet comfort. You earned it. They stood there together, soaking in the moment. There was no urgency, no looming fear, just the simple, profound joy of standing on her own 2 feet. Later that day, Madison received the confirmation she'd been waiting for. The threats were gone. The deal that had put her life in jeopardy was dissolved. The immense pressure that had been crushing her for so long finally lifted. Her company, once on the brink of collapse, was stabilized. Her name, once dragged through the mud, was cleared. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was nothing and no one chasing her. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. That night, they sat together on the porch, watching the sky slowly darken from a brilliant orange to a deep, velvety blue. Everything is so quiet, she said, more to herself than to him. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This is the part people forget, he said thoughtfully. She looked at him, curious. What part? He met her gaze, his eyes serious but kind. The part where you decide who you are without all the noise. Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy or awkward. It was an honest, shared space between them. Madison broke it first, her voice barely a whisper. When I was lying in that SUV, trapped and injured, I thought my life was over. Not because of my leg, but because I felt completely and utterly alone. She turned toward him, her expression open and vulnerable. Then a stranger stopped. You didn't ask who I was, or what I could offer you in return. You just stayed. Ethan looked down at his hands, a humble gesture. I did what anyone should do. She shook her head firmly. No, you did what very few people actually do. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I don't want to go back to the life I had before. All the pressure, the constant striving. I want something smaller, something real. Ethan listened carefully, his full attention on her. I'm not asking you to change who you are, she continued, her voice gaining strength. I am asking if you would walk beside me as I learn how to be someone new. Ethan felt his chest tighten, a mix of hope and apprehension. I can't promise you a perfect life, he said, his voice raspy with emotion. I'm just a mechanic. There will be bills, long days, ordinary, everyday problems. Madison smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. That sounds like peace. He met her eyes then, and the world seemed to fall away. Then yes, he said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. A simple word that held the weight of a new beginning. Weeks turned into a quiet rhythm. Madison learned to walk without pain, to slow down her frantic pace, to find joy in cooking simple meals. Ethan returned to his daily routine at the shop, but nothing felt the same. He brought her into his world, a world so different from the one she knew. He introduced her to the greasy, familiar scent of his garage, the small town where everyone knew his name, the friendly faces who waved as they drove by, and she fit. She fit in a way that felt natural, without any effort or pretense. One evening, as a light rain fell, not an angry, dangerous storm, but a gentle, cleansing shower, they stood together under the shelter of the porch roof. It's funny, isn't it? Madison said, her head resting on his shoulder. How this all started with a storm. Ethan nodded, looking out at the glistening street, and ended with calm. She leaned into him, not because she needed the support, but because she wanted the closeness. I used to think kindness was a rare thing, she said softly. Now I think it's just quiet. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. And easy to miss if you're not looking. The world kept moving, as it always does. Big stories faded, and sensational headlines were replaced with new ones. But in a small, quiet corner of that world, two lives had been permanently shifted, not by money, or power, or fear, but because one person made the simple decision to stop, and another chose to trust. Their story didn't begin with a dramatic, sweeping romance. It began with a simple act of humanity. And that, in the end, made all the difference. Sometimes, the biggest changes in our lives don't come from grand events. They begin with a small, almost insignificant decision. The choice to stop, the choice to help, the choice to simply care. Kindness doesn't announce itself with a trumpet blast. It shows up quietly, without fanfare. And when it does, when we allow it in, everything can change. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more content that explores the quiet power of the human spirit.